Kansas City, 1935. It was a city of jazz and smoke, of ambition and shadows, and in the heart of it all stood the President Hotel. A grand dame of a building, its brick facade rose proudly against the Midwestern sky. It was a place of elegance, a destination for the well-to-do, for travelling salesmen with stories to tell, and for secrets looking for a place to hide. The lobby was a symphony of polished marble and hushed conversations, where bellhops in smart uniforms moved with practiced efficiency. But even in a place so full of life, some stories begin with an ending, a final chapter written in a room upstairs, a room that would soon become infamous. A room numbered 1046. The air in the 1930s was thick with uncertainty. The Great Depression had cast a long, dark shadow over the country, and Kansas City was no exception. It was a town run by a political machine, a place where fortunes could be made and lives could be lost with startling speed. The President Hotel was an oasis in this turbulent world, a bastion of civility and order. Guests came and went, their arrivals and departures noted with quiet discretion. But on one particular day, a man would check in who would challenge that very order. A man who seemed to have stepped directly out of the city's underbelly, bringing with him a mystery that would linger long after he was gone. Imagine the scene. The clatter of the streetcars outside, the murmur of the city, the sense that anything could happen. Inside the President Hotel, the world felt safe, predictable. The staff knew the rhythms of the day, the comings and goings of the regulars. They were trained to notice things, to be observant but invisible. A guest without luggage might raise an eyebrow, but it wasn't unheard of. A request for an interior room, away from the noise of the street, was perfectly normal. But soon the small, strange details would begin to add up, like notes in a discordant melody that was building toward a terrifying crescendo. And so our story begins, not with a bang, but with a quiet arrival. A man walking into a hotel lobby carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and a secret he would take to his grave. He was about to check into room 1046, a room that would become a permanent fixture in the annals of American true crime. The hotel, in all its grandeur, was an unwitting stage for a tragedy that was about to unfold. A tragedy that, even today, defies explanation, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a ghost in the machine of history. The clock was ticking and time was running out. It was a cold January afternoon, the second day of 1935, when he walked through the revolving doors. He was a tall man, well-dressed in a dark overcoat. He had a distinctive scar on his scalp, visible even with his hair combed over it, and a cauliflower ear that suggested a past filled with rough encounters. He approached the front desk with a calm demeanour, his eyes scanning the lobby as if he were looking for someone, or perhaps making sure no one was looking for him. He asked for a room, specifying that he wanted one on a high floor, an interior room facing the courtyard. He seemed to want privacy, a quiet space away from the prying eyes of the street below. He signed the register with a steady hand, writing the name Roland T. Owen, and listed his home as Los Angeles. He had no luggage, not a single suitcase, not a briefcase, not even a small travel bag. This was unusual, to say the least. When the bellboy, Randolph Propst, offered to help him, Owen simply waved him off. He had nothing to carry. He did, however, have a few small items, a comb, a brush, and a tube of toothpaste, which he kept in his overcoat pocket. The bellboy escorted him up to the 10th floor, to room 1046, a simple, unassuming room that was about to become the centre of a baffling mystery. Once inside the room, Owen's behaviour only grew stranger. He immediately drew the shades, plunging the room into a perpetual twilight. He seemed to want no contact with the outside world, yet he would leave the door unlocked. Sometimes staff would find it locked from the outside, as if someone else had locked it for him when they left. The maid, Mary Soptic, would later recall his odd habits. He would sit in the dark, often for hours, with only a single small lamp casting a dim glow. He rarely left the room, and when he did, he always left the door unlocked behind him. It was a puzzle. A man who wanted absolute privacy, yet left himself completely vulnerable. He told the staff he was waiting for a friend. That was his explanation for everything. The lack of luggage, the need for privacy, the strange comings and goings. He was just waiting. But who was he waiting for? And why was he so secretive? He seemed nervous, on edge, like a man expecting trouble. He would make phone calls, but his conversations were cryptic, overheard fragments that made no sense. He was a phantom, a man without a past who had checked into the President Hotel under a false name and was now living in the shadows of room 1046, waiting for a fate that was drawing closer with every passing hour. The maid, Mary Soptic, was perhaps the last person to see Roland T. Owen under anything resembling normal circumstances. On her rounds, she found him to be a peculiar but polite guest. On the afternoon of January 3rd, she entered his room to clean and found him lying on the bed, fully dressed, in the near total darkness he seemed to prefer. He told her she could clean, but asked her not to lock the door when she left, explaining that a friend was coming to visit him soon. It was the same story he always told, a story that was beginning to feel less like an explanation and more like a premonition, a coded warning of what was to come. Later that same day, Mary returned with fresh towels. She knocked, and a voice she didn't recognize, a rough, low voice, answered from within. "We don't need any towels," the voice said. Mary explained that she had brought them anyway. The voice then said, "Okay, come in." When she entered, she saw Owen sitting on the bed as usual, but there was another man in the room with him, a large, imposing figure she couldn't see clearly in the dim light. On the desk, she noticed a small scrap of paper with a cryptic message scrawled on it. "Don, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The note added another layer to the already dense mystery. The presence of this second man, this Don, was a significant development. Who was he? Was he the friend Owen had been waiting for? Or was he something else entirely? The maid felt a palpable tension in the room, a stark contrast to Owen's usually calm, if strange, demeanour. She quickly left the towels and exited the room, feeling uneasy about what she had witnessed. The door to room 1046 closed behind her, sealing its secrets within. It was a room that was no longer just occupied by a mysterious loner. It was now host to a drama whose players and purpose remained shrouded in darkness. That night, the hotel operator noticed that the phone in room 1046 was off the hook. She sent a bellboy, the same Randolph Probst who had checked Owen in, to investigate. He knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the handle and found it locked from the outside. Using his passkey, he entered the room. He saw Owen lying on the bed, seemingly asleep, a dark shape in the gloom. Assuming the man was simply drunk or had fallen asleep, the bellboy placed the phone back on its cradle and left, locking the door behind him. He didn't know it then, but he had just walked away from the prelude to a murder. The next morning, the morning of January 4th, the telephone in room 1046 was once again off the hook. This was becoming a pattern, a small but persistent signal that something was wrong. The hotel operator, having failed to get a response, dispatched another bellboy, Harold Pike, to check on the guest. When Pike arrived at the 10th floor, he found the door to 1046 was locked, but this time there was something else. A "Do Not Disturb" sign was hanging from the doorknob. This was the first time such a sign had been used by the occupant of the room. It struck Pike as odd, given the guest's previous insistence on leaving the door unlocked. Pike knocked several times loudly. He called out, "Mr. Owen!" But the only response was silence, a deep, unsettling silence that seemed to soak up the sound of his own voice. After several minutes of knocking with no answer, he used his passkey to unlock the door. What he saw inside would stay with him forever. The room was dark, the shades still drawn tight against the morning light. As his eyes adjusted, he could make out a figure on the floor. It was a man, huddled on his knees and elbows, his head cradled in his hands. Pike assumed, as the bellboy the night before had, that the man was simply drunk and had fallen out of bed. Pike took a step into the room and saw something that made him freeze. In the dim light filtering under the door, he could see dark stains on the bedding. The walls, too, seemed to be splattered with a dark liquid. A coppery, metallic smell hung heavy in the air, a smell he couldn't immediately place, but which filled him with a primal sense of dread. He reached for the light switch, but his hand was shaking. He decided not to disturb the guest further. He backed out of the room, reported the situation to his manager, and tried to put the disturbing scene out of his mind. But the image was seared into his memory. The decision was made to wait. Perhaps the man was just sleeping it off. The hotel staff were accustomed to dealing with all sorts of guests and their eccentricities. But this felt different. The locked door, the "Do Not Disturb" sign, the man on the floor, the dark stains. Each detail was a piece of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. It was a quiet, creeping horror, unfolding slowly behind a locked door on the 10th floor. The hotel continued its business. The sounds of the city drifted up from the street, but in room 1046 a man was dying, and no one yet knew the full extent of the nightmare. Hours passed. The "Do Not Disturb" sign remained on the door of room 1046, a silent sentinel guarding a terrible secret. The hotel staff went about their duties, but a sense of unease had settled over the 10th floor. The strange guest in 1046 had become a topic of hushed conversation among the bellboys and maids. He was the man with no luggage, the man who sat in the dark, the man who was now locked in his room, unresponsive. The day wore on, and the silence from the room grew more profound, more ominous. It was the kind of quiet that feels louder than any noise. Then, later that morning, another guest, a woman staying in the adjacent room 1048, reported hearing voices. She told the hotel staff she could hear a man and a woman arguing loudly in or near room 1046. The sounds were muffled, indistinct, but the tone was clearly agitated. She heard what sounded like scuffling, a fight. She couldn't make out the words, but the anger and fear in the voices were unmistakable. The report was noted, but with the "Do Not Disturb" sign still in place, the hotel management was, reluctant to intervene further. They were walking a fine line between guest privacy and growing concern. Later that same day, a different guest, a man in room 1055, also reported hearing strange noises. He described it as a commotion, a lot of noise coming from down the hall near 1046. He too heard voices, but couldn't be sure what they were saying or even how many people were involved. The reports were troubling, painting a picture of a volatile situation unfolding behind the locked door. Who was in the room with Owen? Was it the Don from the note? Was it the woman the other guest had heard? The questions mounted, but the answers remained locked away in the darkened room. The final and most chilling report came in the early hours of the next morning, January 5th. A hotel telephone operator received a call. It wasn't from a room, but it was about a room. A man's voice, frantic and terrified, was on the line. He was screaming, a sound of pure agony that cut through the quiet of the night. The operator could hear the sound of a struggle, of furniture being overturned, then a single guttural cry followed by a loud crash, and then silence. The line went dead. The call had come from the phone in room 1046. The time for waiting was over. Something terrible had happened. Following the terrifying phone call, the hotel management could wait no longer. The police were summoned. When Detective Sergeant Frank Howland and his partner arrived at the President Hotel, they were met by the anxious hotel manager. They proceeded to the 10th floor, to the door of room 1046. The Do Not Disturb sign still hung there, a grimly ironic message. The detectives knocked, announced themselves, and received no reply. Using a passkey, they unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping into a scene of unimaginable horror. The room was a slaughterhouse. The man they knew as Roland T. Owen was alive, but just barely. He was naked, lying on the floor in a pool of his own blood. He had been brutally tortured. His wrists, ankles and neck were bound with cord. There was a deep gash on his chest, and his skull had been fractured from repeated savage blows to the head. The walls were spattered with blood, the bedsheets were soaked, and the telephone stand had been knocked over. It was a scene of ferocious violence, a level of brutality that spoke of rage, of a personal and deeply vicious attack. The man was conscious but unable to speak. As the paramedics rushed the grievously injured man to the hospital, the detectives began to process the crime scene. It was as baffling as it was brutal. There were no weapons to be found in the room. The cords used to bind the victim were gone. The man's clothing was missing. The only personal items left behind were the comb, the brush, and the tube of toothpaste he had arrived with. Bizarrely, a single unsmoked cigarette was found standing upright on the nightstand, and a hairpin was discovered on the floor. There was no sign of the mysterious Don, no trace of the woman who was heard arguing. The attacker, or attackers, had vanished without a trace. At the hospital, the man who called himself Roland T. Owen clung to life for a few more hours. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his body broken. The doctors and police tried to question him, to get a name, a clue, anything that could help them understand what had happened. They asked him who did this to him. He managed to utter a single, cryptic response, "Nobody." When asked what had caused his injuries, he whispered, "I fell against the bathtub." Then he slipped into a coma. He died shortly after, taking his secrets with him. The man from room 1046 was dead, and the mystery had only just begun. The investigation into the murder in room 1046 began with a frustrating lack of information. The first and most pressing task was to identify the victim. The police quickly determined that Roland T. Owen was an alias. They ran the name through their records and came up empty. No one by that name existed in Los Angeles or anywhere else they could find. They fingerprinted the victim, but the prints matched no one in their databases. They released a description of the man, the scar, the cauliflower ear, to the public, hoping someone would come forward. But no one did. The victim was a ghost, a John Doe. The crime scene itself offered few clues. The room had been wiped clean of any fingerprints except for those of the victim and some unidentifiable smudges. The missing weapon, the missing clothing, and the missing cords all pointed to a killer who was careful, methodical, and determined to leave nothing behind. The detectives were stumped. They had a body, a brutalized body, but no identity. They had a crime scene, a horrific crime scene, but no weapon and no forensic evidence to point to a suspect. They were chasing shadows, trying to solve a murder where both the victim and the killer seemed to have materialized out of thin air. The few leads they had were frustratingly vague. The maid's description of the second man, Don, was too general to be of any real use. The reports of arguing voices, one male and one female, suggested multiple people were involved, but who were they? The police interviewed every guest on the 10th floor, every employee of the hotel, but no one could provide a clear description or a concrete lead. The mystery deepened with every dead end. It was as if the events in room 1046 had taken place in a separate reality, leaving behind only the bloody aftermath. Then came the anonymous communications. A few days after the murder, the police received a phone call. The caller, a woman, claimed that the man in room 1046 was from a nearby town and had gotten into trouble with some people there. She provided a name, but it led nowhere. Later, a letter arrived at the police station. The writer claimed to have seen the victim and knew he was going to be killed. The letter was rambling and incoherent, offering no real clues. Were these genuine tips or cruel hoaxes? The police couldn't be sure. The case was drowning in a sea of speculation, rumour and fear. As weeks turned into months, the story of the man in room 1046 became a local legend, a chilling tale whispered in the bars and cafes of Kansas City. The police, desperate for a breakthrough, decided to take a drastic step. They arranged for the victim's body to be put on public display at a local funeral home, hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize him. Thousands of people filed past the open casket, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and pity. They stared at the man with the scar and the cauliflower ear, the man who had been tortured and killed, but no one could put a name to the face. He remained a stranger to them all. Just when it seemed the case would go cold forever, another bizarre twist occurred. The funeral home that was holding the body received an anonymous phone call. The caller, a man, wanted to know about the funeral arrangements. He said he would pay for the burial. A few days later, an envelope arrived containing cash, enough to cover the full cost of a modest funeral. The sender was anonymous. The victim was to be buried in a potter's field, but now, thanks to this mysterious benefactor, he would have a proper burial. The caller also specified that he wanted him buried in Memorial Park Cemetery. The funeral was a strange, sad affair. The service was attended only by the detectives working the case and the minister who performed the rites. They were burying a man they did not know, a man whose life and death were a complete enigma. As they lowered the casket into the ground, they had no idea who had paid for this final act of dignity. Was it a grieving family member, too afraid to come forward? Or was it the killer, overcome with a pang of guilt? The question hung in the air as heavy and unanswered as all the others. And then, as if to add a final floral punctuation mark to the mystery, another anonymous delivery was made. A bouquet of flowers arrived at the gravesite. The card attached contained a cryptic, heartbreaking message. It read, "Love forever, Louise." Who was Louise? Was she the woman heard arguing in the room? Was she a secret lover, a sister, a wife? The police tried to trace the flowers, but the trail went cold, just like every other lead in the case. The identity of Louise remains one of the most tantalizing and frustrating secrets of the entire affair. A whisper of a name in an ocean of silence. Years passed, the world moved on. The Great Depression gave way to a world war, and the jazz-filled nights of 1930s Kansas City faded into memory. But the story of Room 1046 never completely disappeared. It lingered, a ghost story grounded in brutal fact. Then, in 1937, a woman named Ruby Ogletree read an old newspaper article about the unsolved murder. The description of the man, the scar, the cauliflower ear, sounded hauntingly familiar. It sounded like her son, Artemus Ogletree, who had left home in 1934 and had not been heard from since. She contacted the Kansas City Police Department. They compared the information she provided with the few details they had. Artemus had a scar on his scalp from a childhood accident. He had a cauliflower ear from wrestling. The timeline fit. The police exhumed the body from Memorial Park Cemetery for her to identify. Though the years had taken their toll, she was certain it was her son. The man in room 1046 finally had a name, Artemis Ogletree. But this solution only opened up a new set of questions. Why was he in Kansas City? Why did he use a false name? And who was Louise? The identity of Artemis Ogletree did little to solve the central mystery of his murder. His mother revealed that he'd received letters from a Louise before he disappeared, letters that seemed to cause him great distress. The police now had a name, but they were no closer to finding the killer or understanding the motive. Was it a crime of passion involving this mysterious Louise? Was it a gambling debt gone wrong? Or was Artemis involved in something far more dangerous, something connected to the city's powerful criminal underworld? The theories were endless, but the evidence was non-existent. And so the case of room 1046 remains frozen in time. An unsolved chapter in the annals of true crime. We have a name for the victim, but his story is still a blank page. We know how he died, but we don't know why. The identity of Don, the man in the room, and Louise, the woman who sent the flowers, are secrets the grave will likely keep forever. The President Hotel still stands in Kansas City, though it has been converted into apartments. But the ghost of room 1046, the story of Artemis Ogletree, endures, a chilling reminder that some mysteries are never solved and some voices are never heard again.